Good morning. I'm here to read from Grass-Fed Cattle, How to Produce and Market Natural Beef by Julius Ruechel. We're on to Chapter 4. Let's get set up. It's very early here in the morning. Chapter 4, Grass and Grazing. By the way, this is the first chapter I'm reading aloud here that I have not actually read yet, so excited to learn some new stuff. Let's go. The cattle industry is unique. It turns sunshine into cash. Most industries require purchased energy to turn raw resources into something that can be used and sold, but the cattle industry relies on sunlight, which in the process of photosynthesis in grass combines with the chlorophyll to convert carbon dioxide and water into the organic materials that are used as the building blocks for plant growth. By converting the grass to beef, we make a saleable product, and best of all, the cattle do all the work of harvesting, receiving as payment the joy of eating. It sounds like an impossible dream, but the simplicity epitomizes an efficient grass-based system. Our opportunity lies in managing the cattle's grazing behavior in such a way that the grass collects as much free solar energy as possible, and our bovine labor force efficiently converts this energy to saleable product. We are the orchestra conductors. The grass and cattle are the moosicians that do all the work. Call me Beethoven. Alright, let's get to it. The Rumen, the forge that turns grass into beef. You're going to want to learn about the Rumen. Pay attention. Grass is tough and is not easy to digest. It is so tough, in fact, that the human digestive system cannot sufficiently break down its cellulose structure to derive any nutritional benefit from it. What he means by that is that you'll shit it all out. When grass appeared on the landscape 24 million years ago, new grazing species such as ruminants, four-stomach-chambered cud chewers, evolved to make use of it. To break down the cellulose structure of grass, these creatures, such as cows, evolved an ingenious digestive system. An army of microorganisms lives inside the rumen, the first stomach chamber, and waits for grass to come down the hatch in order to feed on it. These microorganisms break down this tough cellulose structure of grass so calories and nutrients can be extracted in the next 3 stomach chambers. Without these cellulose digesting microorganisms, grass would offer cows very little nutritional value. As a reward for their vital activity, microorganisms in the rumen consume their share of proteins. Only excess proteins and the protein released by the microorganisms at the end of their short life cycle pass to the other stomach chambers and become accessible to the cow. Even when the rumen environment is functioning optimally, the rumination process is not particularly efficient at extracting nutrients from the grass, which is why so much partially digested grass is returned to the soil via manure. Soil microbes rely on this partially digested manure to retain the soil's fertility, thereby completing the self-sustaining cycle between grass, cow, and rumen, and the soil that supports them. The microorganisms responsible for fermenting and breaking down the cellulose structure of grass in the rumen are most active in an environment with a slightly acid pH of 6.4. If stomach acidity increases to a pH of 6.2 or less, these cellulose digesting microorganisms become inactive and the nutrients in the grass remain locked inside the cellulose structure. Remember that humans have a stomach pH of about 1.5. So much more acidic than this. Because actually, it's not like 6 times more alkaline if it's a 6.4 to a 1.5. It's like each number. It's like the earthquake system. Each number is times 10. So from 1 to 2 is 10 times more. So anyway, we are super acid. Cows are slightly acid. The grass, if the cellulose digesting microorganisms become inactive and the nutrients in the grass remain locked inside the cellulose structure, if their stomach gets too acid. Digesting grains, described below, increases the stomach acidity inside the rumen. Thus, when a cow is fed supplemental grain as part of her diet, the valuable cellulose-digesting microorganisms in her rumen are deactivated by the increased stomach acidity, causing the grass to pass through the digestive system without the cow being able to access nutrients within it. Tragic. The small amounts of grass seeds consumed on pasture are not enough to cause a sufficient increase in stomach acidity, so cellulose-digesting microorganisms remain active. In the wild, ruminant... let's just look up here to this anatomy of a grass, right? The anatomy of a blade of grass under increasing magnification, showing from left to right. The grass leaf, the tip of the new leaf bud, a single plant cell, and the tough cellulose structure of the outer cell wall. So there's a lot going on in there. It's like very thick, many layers, even on just this tiny little grass. In the wild, ruminant diets consist primarily of grasses and herbs. Grass and herb, please. Only a very small portion of their diet is made up of the seeds and grains that occur naturally on pasture, with a little making its way in when ruminants are forced to eat overly mature grass. Unless these seeds and grains are damaged in some way, a large proportion of them will pass through the animal undigested. Often this process is a necessary part of the life cycle of the grass seed. The acid environment of the stomach weakens the tough seed shell, allowing it to germinate more easily when it reaches the soil. After the seed is expelled, the manure around the seed provides fertilizer that kickstarts the germination process. In agriculture, this process is mimicked by seed scarification, a mechanical process that breaks down the tough outer seed shell to help facilitate germination. Efficient digestion of seeds is left to other non-ruminant species, such as birds, which are able to break down and mill the seeds in their digestive tracts. Interesting. The small amount of seed that inadvertently passes through a cow's digestive system during grazing is digested by a second set of microorganisms in the rumen that evolved specifically to process seed grains. These grain-digesting microorganisms are more aggressive than the cellulose-digesting ones, but the lack of grain in a typical grassland diet generally keeps them from overpowering those that digest cellulose. Interesting. If a cow consumes unnaturally high amounts of grain, as do conventionally raised cattle, the grain-digesting microorganisms quickly overrun the rumen environment. Their digestive process increases the acidity of the rumen to a pH between 5.8 and 5.3, well outside the tolerance levels of cellulose-digesting microorganisms, effectively causing their digestive process to shut down. They just go on strike and they're like, it's too acid, we can't work like this, bitch. And I mean, there are parallels to similar things in humans because we are capable of influencing our own gut environment by the foods that we eat. And if you feed certain populations of gut organisms and not other ones, then you are favoring those and they will take over. It's a question of what you feed them, right? And then what that means for you is that you have a different gut environment. Your gut city is got a different flavor, and that could be a good or bad thing. But ultimately, they're going to be fighting it out down there based on what you feed them and how your life is going and the stresses that they are impacted by, but primarily food. As a result, the grass passes through the cow's digestive system without the cow being able to access the nutrients locked inside the grass's tough cellular structure. Just said that. Therefore, when a cow's diet becomes too rich in grain, the grass portion of her diet will function strictly as a source of roughage, fiber, slowing down the grain in the digestive tract so the grain microorganisms can digest them before they're expelled in manure. I mean, do you see the implications here? A cow is designed to eat grass. They're a grass-eating machine, right? But all you've got to do is change up their diet a little bit to grain, and suddenly it throws everything off, and to them grass becomes just fiber again, like it is for us, just from a lifestyle change. Despite the fact that over millions of years they've adapted to eat this grass, you can ruin all that like quite easily. It's really a delicate balance in nature. Because cattle are not equipped to deal with a high-grain diet on a regular basis, their bodies cannot cope with the natural digestive toxins and high acidity of grain digestion. In feedlot animals on extremely high-grain diets, the resulting stress over the long term is so high that their livers shut down, causing them to die sometime after their second birthday if they are not slaughtered before. Makes me mad. If we want our cattle to live naturally on grass, grain simply has no place in the equation. I hope he's convinced you. Root reserves and the ideal grazing interval. A grass plant has roughly the same amount of plant material below the surface as is visible above it. The roots are essentially a mirror image of the green grass above ground. As the leaves and stems grow, so do the roots. When the grass is cropped, the roots die back in an effort to maintain a balance between the solar energy harvesting material above ground and the nutrient and water harvesting root system below. A large plant requires a large root system to gather nutrients and water from the ground. When a plant is grazed, the remaining above-ground portion, responsible for photosynthesis, is able to provide solar energy to only a small root structure. The excess root mass dies off to rebalance the energy drain on the plant. Each time a plant is grazed, dead grass roots decompose, building up the organic components of the soil. Doesn't that sound wonderful? And let's look at this little chart above. Picture thing. We see this cattle. We see the grass, feed. Where do we start here? The self-sustaining cycle involving grass, cow, and rumen and the soil that supports them. I mean, just take a look. You're going to see the picture. Cow, rumen enzymes break down cellulose structure, expel as manure, partially digested plant residues, returns to the soil microbes digestion kick-started by the partially digested plant residues expelled by the cow, release nutrients from the organic residue and minerals in the soil, organic and inorganic soil nutrients, back to the feed, which is eaten by the cow in the form of the grass. We get the idea. Roots contain a plant's stored energy reserves. When drought or cold weather hits, this energy reserve allows the plant to survive. A small plant with an inadequate root system will simply die. As the dormant season approaches, a large root system beneath the soil surface gives the plant greater resistance to frost or extreme heat. After the plant becomes dormant, the root reserve remains unchanged, even if the plant material above the soil surface is removed by grazing. These stored reserves in the dormant plant's roots allow it to regrow quickly at the onset of warm spring weather or the arrival of the rainy season. If a plant is cropped too close to the ground before it becomes dormant, it will have much less energy to draw from when it resumes growth. Clearly, this has important implications for grazing management in terms of both the timing of the harvest and the amount to harvest before the onset of winter. As the plant grows, its root reserves must build up before maximum growth above ground is possible. Once the root reserve has reached a critical mass, plant growth above ground accelerates until it reaches the mature seed-forming stage. So you invest in the roots, and then once the grass feels comfortable with its root situation, it starts sprouting. If a herd leaves a tall grass residual after grazing, the root reserves will not die off below that critical mass, allowing rapid regrowth to continue without interruption. If the grass is cropped too short, however, the root reserve must rebuild to regain critical mass before accelerated grass growth can resume. For example, if grass is cropped to a 3-inch residual, the regrowth will have only a 3-inch root mass from which to draw energy reserves and access soil moisture. Clearly, this is not much, particularly when the summer sun has dried out the soil and the top few inches are dusty and dry. If a minimum grass residual of 10 inches is always maintained during the growing season, the roots will have a 10-inch root zone to draw on, which gives the plant a much larger energy reserve and mineral bank, a deeper moisture zone to draw on for quick regrowth. The grazing cow or harvester should not spend too much time in any one area or repeat its migration pattern too soon to safeguard the grass from being cut too short. Grass can be cropped much shorter during the winter season after the frost kills vegetative portions of the plant above the soil's surface. This is explained in much greater detail during the discussion about winter grazing in Chapter 7. Let's take a look below here before we move on. The grass nutrient value. And so we see that there's sort of a curve here of going from tiny little baby to eventually an adult dying piece of grass. Grass nutrient value, the growth slows in the middle. Optimal time for grazing is basically that peak section, and then right after that, this is when the seeds form. When seeds form, basically the grass is saying, we're done with the growth part, it's time for reproduction, right? The stages of grass growth, left to right. The seedling matures to fully grown grass plant, which matures to seed formation and then dies, leaving behind a dry seed head and stalk. The grass growth rate stops altogether at the seed formation stage. The grass nutrient value drops off sharply once grass begins seed formation. When grass reaches maturity, its growth slows. That's what I just said. The plant's energy is redirected toward seed formation, and nutrients from the green vegetative plant parts are drawn up into the seed head. Eventually, growth halts, and the nutritional value of the leafy parts decreases significantly. To maximize grass production, solar harvesting, grazing should be timed to prevent grass from going to seed. So we don't want all our plants investing in seed stuff all the time, because we just don't need that, and it's not the optimal time for them to be eaten by the cattle. So there's a little tiny chart up above here, the S-curve of grass productivity, and basically we want to catch it at the right place on this chart, which is in that shaded area, the ideal grazing interval. Maximum plant height before grazing, minimum plant height after grazing. So we want to keep it in that range at all times. That's the idea. We don't want the grass ever getting too short, which means we got to move our cows before that happens. As grass matures and begins to die, the head material prevents sunlight from reaching the new shoots at the base of the plant. Unless the dead material is removed, it chokes out future grass productivity. Grazing animals help keep grass healthy and productive. For a cow to have an incentive to remove it, she must have access to it before it becomes overly mature, unpalatable, and less nutritious. The grass must be in the vegetative growth stage for the cow to gain enough energy from the grass to make it worth her while to harvest it. The grazing rotation has to be timed carefully so that the herd returns before the grass enters its mature seed formation stage. Striking the perfect balance here is the key to a highly productive, low-cost beef production system. The illustration above shows how grass production speeds up after the root reserve has been established, and how it slows when the plant reaches maturity, forming an S-curve of growth. Maximum production is possible when grass is grazed just prior to reaching the seed formation stage, and when the residual is tall enough to provide an ample root reserve, so the grass can resume growing quickly after grazing. This is the ideal grazing interval. A recipe for healthy soil. Not surprisingly, there is more to keeping grass healthy and productive than just careful timing of a herd's migration. Healthy soil is also critical. The top 5 inches of soil is the gold mine that keeps grass healthy. It is where almost everything happens. The success of your entire grazing program depends on how well you manage the topsoil. So we are in the grass business, but we're maybe even on a deeper level in the soil business. Oxygen penetrates only about 5 inches into the soil, slightly deeper if the soil is cultivated. Below this layer, the soil is anaerobic, making it far less active biologically. That is why at ground level a fence post rots and tips over, but below the oxygenated soil layer the wood remains sound much longer. Oxygen has to be present in sufficient quantity for soil microbes to do their job. These aerobic microbes are responsible for decomposing dead plant material and animal manure and reincorporating the nutrients and organic matter in the soil in a form that can be used by plants. Essentially, the soil functions like a cow's rumen. Many of the microorganisms responsible for breaking down grass in the rumen are also responsible for breaking down organic material and releasing nutrients into the soil. Without a healthy microbiology to keep the nutrient cycle functioning, soil would behave like a hydroponic system in a greenhouse. The nutrients for plant growth would need to be added artificially in water-soluble form to make plants grow, but the system would not be self-sustaining. Instead, it would be sterile and unproductive, dead without artificial inputs. Healthy soil and its biological components need oxygen to breathe and live. Organic topsoil should be composed of 25% air and 25% water. When the soil becomes compacted, air and water cannot reach the soil microbes to keep them active, and the plant roots are not able to spread out to access nutrients and water. As we will see below, cattle are our most powerful tool in creating and maintaining sustainable, healthy, well-aerated pasture soils that are essential to the survival of the vast diversity of plants, animals, and microorganisms that sustain valuable grass cover and determine our profitability. Organic matter is the most important soil component, but it accounts for no more than 5% of the soil. Inorganic soil particles such as clay, sand, silt, and gravel comprise the remaining 45%. Plant nutrients are stored in the organic layer as stable organic compounds. Without this organic component, the soil microorganisms would not be able to live, and the nutrients would be flushed away by groundwater. The organic components binds the soil together, giving it a porous structure that retains air, water, and nutrients. Without organic matter, the soil becomes extremely vulnerable to erosion, and without cohesiveness, wind and water can grab soil particles and sweep them away. I hope you're starting to realize that rocks, inorganic matter, and organic matter are in a constant dance in the world. Like, it's like the butterfly that flaps its wings in Peking and delivers a storm elsewhere in the world, the chaos effect or whatever. Whether that's true or not, exactly, that's the general gist of the idea, is that if there was not organic matter on this planet, literally the dirt, the rocks, they would be affected. Everything is working together. In a healthy grass-based pasture management system that mimics the relationship of wild herds and grassland, soil compaction is prevented in a number of ways. When a herd grazes an area, it quickly sweeps across it before continuing its migration, pasture rotation. The animals do not stay long enough to use the same shady sites and paths day after day, and because they do not linger, they do not pound and compact grazed areas. As they sweep through an area, they break up the soil with their hooves, thereby naturally aerating the soil. This is particularly effective when cattle become excited, as in the presence of a predator, for example. If they remain too long in an area, the repeated impact of their hooves on the soil would compact the soil instead of providing this beneficial aerating effect. So it's all about balance and just that right amount of something or other. The herd keeps the grass healthy, and, in turn, grass roots loosen the soil as they force their way down in search of water and nutrients. As plants die back in response to grazing, dead roots provide pathways for air, water, microorganisms, and earthworms to penetrate the soil. As the organisms travel, they further aerate the soil, increasing its porous, sponge-like texture. Hooves also break apart dead plant material and manure piles, spreading them out and pushing them down into the moist soil, where they will come into contact with microbes responsible for decomposing the dead plant and manure particles. Without this trampling action, the nutrients from the manure and dead plant materials would not be recycled. See pages 11 through 13 for a discussion of how decomposition varies according to climate. Instead, they would remain on the dry soil surface and slowly oxidize in the sun until they are blown away by the wind. Tragic. Let's look at these two little pictures. Above, we have air, inorganic particles, water, and organics. A healthy topsoil is composed of 25% air, 25% water, 45% inorganic particles such as gravel, sand, silt, and clay, and 5% organic matter. And then below, a cow's sharp hooves can be nature's mechanism to ensure effective plant decomposition and nutrient recycling, loosen compacted soils, and prepare the ground surface for maximum water absorption. So if you don't have cattle, the soil will never be able to absorb water as well, at least in certain climates. Particularly in dry regions, trampling hooves are the recycling mechanism that completes the nutrient cycle between soil and grass. Let's take a look at grass varieties. The world's wild grasslands contain a phenomenal variety of plant species, contrasting starkly with the monoculture approach typical of most modern farmland and pastures. This diversity is possible in the wild because nature does not need to maximize harvest yields on specific harvest dates and does not require crop-specific harvest equipment. The plants are specifically suited to the grazing needs of the great herds, which require a stable food supply that remains vegetative and nutritious over the longest possible time period during the growth season and that maintains its nutrient quality so it can be rationed successfully over the winter. A single massive yield that matures all at once would be wasted. The excesses would be unpalatable and lose their nutritional value. A monoculture grass supply cannot satisfy a grazing herd's nutrient requirements through the seasons without artificial feed supplements. A variety of plant species produces a more consistent food supply over the full growing season and extends the growing season in spring and fall as grass species complement and supplement each other. This smorgasbord of grazing plants flourishes in the various environmental niches and climatic conditions of the growing season. The buffet includes frost-tolerant plants, heat-tolerant plants, plants adapted to specific soil conditions, and plants whose growth peaks at different times during the growing season. For example, a pasture in the northern prairie region might include Altai wild rye for its ability to stand up through the snowpack and provide nutrient-rich winter grazing, tall wheatgrass for its winter hardiness, reed canary grass for its tolerance to waterlogged soil conditions, Caesar milk vetch for its drought tolerance, crusted wheatgrass for its early spring and fall grazing, Russian wild rye for its tolerance to salinity and for providing early spring grazing, meadow fescue for its heat and drought tolerance, alfalfa for its deep roots, drought tolerance and nitrogen fixing ability, and alsiki clover for its tolerance to spring flooding and alkaline soil conditions. I apologize to all the grasses that I mispronounced. Because the nutrient and mineral content of each plant differs, animals are able to pick and choose based on their individual needs. The wider variety of the food the herd can choose from, the more balanced its diet, and the healthier it will be. This is a major component of plant consumption, generally, I've noticed, is that variety is so key. And, man, I could tie like this to another book that I've been reading about cities. Diversity is so key in so many aspects of life. And when we focus on single trait selection, right? With the cows. If you focus on one trait, you're going to miss out on the overall quality of the animal. And the overall quality of the ecosystem depends on a wide variety of different plants working together, competing, forming a grass society, as it were, over the course of the year. As plant varieties increase, so does the range over which their roots access soil nutrients, making the plant community as a whole more resilient to nutrient deficiencies and reducing the nutrient drain from any single root zone. For example, while alfalfa plants have roots that extend down 20 feet into the soil, holy crap, with some reportedly going down as deep as 100 feet. Wow, alfalfa. Many grasses are shallow feeders, their roots staying within the top few feet of the soil surface. If deep feeding plants such as alfalfa are part of the plant community, their roots bring up minerals from the deep in the subsoil, making them available to other shallow-rooted plants that otherwise would never have access to them. And here we see that even inefficiency in the system is part of the beauty of the system. Because if it just took all those nutrients and was able to absorb them 100%, the alfalfa, right, then none of those things would be actually brought to the other grasses in the upper parts of the soil in the community, right? So there's some inefficiency where the alfalfa isn't getting all of that and is therefore sharing with others. In addition, the root acids of certain plants are more efficient than those of others at accessing minerals from inorganic soil particles, which help them to introduce new minerals into the nutrient cycle. These specialized root acids are able to dissolve minerals out of inorganic soil particles to feed their nutrient requirements, thus making these new minerals part of a plant's organic molecular structure, so that once the plant dies and is reincorporated into the soil, these new minerals can be recycled by other plants that are not capable of accessing minerals directly from inorganic soil particles. Plant variety is the key to creating a resilient food supply that extends uniformly across the longest possible growing season. Each species fills a different niche in the food supply. Each species fills a different niche in the food supply during the year. Got the coffee burps. Cool season plants flourish in spring and fall, but slow their growth and lignify, become hard and less palatable in summer heat above 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm season plants flourish during the summer heat, but are dormant during the cooler spring and fall. Deep-rooted plants provides access to new nutrients from deep in the subsoil. Some plants are able to overcome nutrient deficiencies in the soil by using their specialized root acids to access nutrients from otherwise inaccessible inorganic sand, silt, and clay particles. Some plants concentrate certain minerals and vitamins that are essential to livestock. Nitrogen-fixing plants such as legumes draw nitrogen from the air. Plants thrive in different moisture and soil conditions. For example, drought conditions, moisture-saturated, swampy soils, sandy, well-drained soils, acidic soils, cold soils, and frost, balancing the food supply. While the leaves of some plants retain their nutrients longer over their winter or dry season, the nutritional value of other plants collapses in the dormant season, and still others are more susceptible to nutrient leaching from winter rains and wet weather. Altai wild rye, for example, becomes more palatable in winter as frost and moisture break down its hard stems. Typically, native grasses hold their nutrient value for longer periods during winter than do domesticated grass varieties. Strong stem plants that stand up and are visible through the snow, for example, Altai wild rye and grazing corn, attract livestock. Weak, frail plants are crushed by the snowpack. Ultimately, there is a plant that thrives in almost every imaginable environmental niche. The trick to planning a grazing program is to consider the various environmental conditions on your farm and to plan for a variety of species that spread the food supply across the full spectrum of temperature, weather, moisture, and soil conditions. So throughout the year. Wild plant species thriving in uncultivated areas on your farm, such as natural meadows and fence rows, are excellent indicators of which species will do well in your pasture conditions. Your local agricultural extension service, agricultural department, or forage seed dealer will be able to provide you with publications about your local grass and legume species, describing their specific tolerances or adaptations to the various soil, grazing, and climatic conditions of your area. Rejuvenating old pastures. Although it is tempting to rip up unproductive or monoculture pastures to reseed them with the most ideal grass varieties, it is far more economical to begin by reworking the grazing pattern of your herd so it efficiently takes advantage of the full potential of your current grass resource. Changing your grazing management inevitably improves old pastures, even without reseeding or overseeding, laying grass seed onto existing turf, because it creates an environment that makes desirable plant species more competitive and restricts competition from less desirable grazing plants. Niches open up and new plants emerge in the pasture. Seeds that blow in or are already in the ground have an opportunity to germinate, unlike in a continuous grazing system or an inefficient grazing rotation, where hard ground and hungry mouths prevent new seedlings from taking root. Introducing new plant species into pastures with less than ideal conditions, for instance, overgrazed, compacted soils, poor nutrient cycling, poor manure distribution, dead material. Introducing the new plant species into pasture with less than ideal conditions at high cost merely treats the symptoms of poor grazing management and does not translate into a long-term sustainable increase in production. At some point, you may want to introduce new seed to your pastures. For example, if your herd's grazing management reaches the full carrying capacity of your land, if you are trying to improve the quality of your pastures in preparation for grass finishing, or to balance out the grass availability over the course of the seasons for successful winter grazing. Overseeding established pastures is never easy because the competition from existing plants makes it difficult for new seeds to germinate and establish themselves. There are several methods to counter this. One is to use range seeder implements designed to cut through the sod mat and plant seeds into it. Another is to harrow the pasture aggressively after broadcast seeding and then repack it to ensure good seed-to-soil contact. Many unproductive grass sods and legumes can be rejuvenated simply by disking across the pasture, which aerates the soil, loosens root-bound sod mats, and promotes tillering new shoots that sprout from the base of the grass. Unfortunately, all of these approaches requires expensive equipment and fuel, and the results are highly unpredictable, depending on primarily the success of your grazing management after overseeding to ensure that new seedlings are not outcompeted by the existing grass sod. Alternatively, you can let the cattle do the work for you. Simply mix the grass and legume seeds onto their loose mineral supplements, and they will distribute the seeds for you in their manure. After all, that's how nature reseeds itself in the wild. Sounds like the way to go. The manure provides essential nutrients and nitrogen right where the new seedlings need it, and the trampling hooves help plant the seeds into the soil. The harsh digestive environment of the cow's stomach also increases the likelihood of successful germination, because acidity helps break down tough outer seed shells. You can also periodically delay grazing until after the grasses have gone to seed so that fresh seeds can be knocked to the ground and pressed into the soil by cows' trampling hooves. You can manipulate the timing of your grazing rotation to promote specific desirable grass species, or you can graze cattle heavily when undesirable species are most vulnerable. Every plant has a weak point in its life cycle during which grazing either kills it or makes it less competitive than other plants in the pasture. Similarly, each plant has a period in its life cycle when grazing promotes tillering and seed transport or gives it a competitive edge over its neighboring plants so it can choke them out. Given the unpredictable results of overseeding, it is rarely worth the large investment. Cultivating and reseeding a pasture from scratch will certainly produce a pasture with desired plant species, but at a considerable financial cost and with a limited lifespan if you do not implement a healthy, well-managed grazing strategy. In addition, it generally takes 2 to 3 years to establish a new pasture sod, during which the pastures produce very little and the seed bed is extremely vulnerable to the harsh impact of the grazing herd. Yet, by manipulating the timing and intensity of each grazing rotation and by using cattle to introduce new seeds to the pasture, you can rejuvenate old pasture stands as efficiently or even more efficiently than you could by mechanical means without the cost of heavy equipment and labor, without putting your current pasture productivity on hold while you wait for the new seed bed to be established, and often within a similar time frame as reseeding. A healthy, well-planned grazing strategy will continue to improve pasture productivity, robustness, and resilience to drought and other climatic challenges long after the 3 transitional years of introducing a healthy, well-planned grazing strategy are over. But patience and planning are key. Note that my references to your farm and your pasture conditions and your area are equally valid whether the land is deeded or leased, because in either case, readers will be responsible for managing the plant species and grazing strategy on the land that they are using. I prefer not to open up the topic of leasing versus buying at this point so that readers can concentrate on one concept at a time. End of chapter 4, and end of part 1 as well. So we're on to part 2 in the next chapter, chapter 5. So that wasn't too long. We learned some things about grass, and we're learning technical pieces of information that are useful for a particular type of farmer, right? But we're also learning kind of how the ecosystems work in general. And we see that these plants, like grass for instance, it's just highly variable. There's all different kinds you wouldn't even know, and what plays out over the course of a year, the grass year, is quite fascinating. And we see that part of the strategy, because plants do have survival strategies, part of the strategy for them is to find not just a set of skills that allows them to survive, but also a timing for those set of skills. Plants need to know their strengths and weaknesses, and if just a grass that's really more hardy and capable of dealing with winter, but more sensitive to sunlight, if that grass just shows up in the summer and is like, hey guys, it's just going to get taken out, that's not going to work for it. So it's part of this competition, and part of the selection process and evolution of these grasses is learning who they are, knowing themselves, and when to make their appearances, what kind of nutrients to have, because ultimately they don't really get to decide when they're eaten. And Julius was saying that certain grasses will have points in their lives when they would prefer not to be eaten, Well, they can't run away. So the way that they design their lives for survival is all according to certain things of timing and when they appear and are they at their strength at that time. Timing is everything for these grasses. So many types of grass. All right.